Okay, so when you think about the Protestant Reformation, who pops into your head? Martin Luther, right? John Calvin? For sure. But what about the guy who spent his entire life just trying to keep their whole movement from flying apart at the seams? Well, today we're going to talk about Martin Bucer, maybe the most important and most forgotten hero of the Reformation.
To really get Camp Bucer, we have to picture the world he was living in. I mean, this was an age of huge ideas and even bigger personalities. Theological squabbles weren't just academic debates, they could literally tear countries apart, and Bucer's entire life was spent right in the middle of it all, trying to be a peacemaker in an age of firebrands.
And there is no better example of what he was up against than this absolutely brutal shutdown from Martin Luther himself. Picture this. They're at a big meeting in Marburg. Bucer's trying to find some common ground, and Luther just hits him with this: "Your spirit and our spirit do not agree." Ouch. That pretty much sums up the wall of opposition Bucer faced from day one.
And really, the two men couldn't have been more different. You've got Luther, who was, brash, gruff, sometimes just plain rude. And then you have Bucer, who was his total polar opposite. If Luther was the hammer, smashing the old world to bits, Bucer was the patient diplomat, trying to build bridges between all the new pieces.
So how does the guy with that kind of temperament even end up in the middle of a revolution? Well, his journey wasn't some fiery overnight conversion. It was a slow, thoughtful, intellectual awakening. Let's take a look at how he got there.
So Bucer actually starts out as a monk in a Dominican monastery. Pretty standard stuff. But then, in 1518, everything changes. He hears Martin Luther speak, and he is just captivated. That one event sets him on a completely new path. He ends up leaving the monastery, he gets married, and by 1523, he shows up in the city of Strasbourg with literally nothing to his name except his ideas.
And it's there, in Strasbourg, that Bucer finds his life's mission. See, he wasn't content to just reform one city. He had a much bigger, almost impossible goal: to hold the entire Protestant movement together. This became his obsession, the thing that drove him for the next 30 years. To really understand Bucer's mission, you have to get this word: conciliator. That's who he was deep down. While everyone else was busy writing these angry condemnations of each other, Bucer was the one traveling all over Europe, writing letters, begging people to find some common ground, especially between the Lutherans and the Zwinglians, who were just bitterly divided.
And the man's intellect was just staggering. I mean, he was a writing machine. His German works alone fill 18 volumes, and his Latin works fill another 7. He wrote about everything, from super complex theology like the Lord's Supper, to really practical stuff like guides on marriage. All of it was aimed at bringing people together and educating them.
But his job in Strasbourg was anything but easy. He was constantly caught in the middle, fighting this two-front war. On one side, you had the Roman Catholics trying to shut him down, and on the other, you had these radical reformers, the Anabaptists, who were telling him his reforms weren't nearly radical enough. He was getting it from all sides.
And as you can probably imagine, trying to be the calm voice of reason in an age of total extremes, well, it took a massive toll on him. His life's work, this quest for unity, was often just one long story of frustration and, frankly, a lot of pain. I mean, despite all the travel, all the writing, all the careful theological arguments like his Wittenberg Concord, his big plans to unite the major Protestant factions just kept falling apart. Every single time he thought he was close, someone's stubbornness or suspicion would just blow the whole thing up. It had to be heartbreaking.
And here's the really ironic part. His tireless push for compromise? People didn't always see it as a good thing. To the really hardline Zwinglians, the fact that he was even willing to talk to the Lutherans felt like a betrayal. They gave him this nickname, the Fanatic of Unity, and trust me, it was not meant as a compliment.
On top of all of that professional failure, he was hit with an absolutely unimaginable personal tragedy. In 1541, the plague just ripped through Strasbourg. And in that one awful year, Bucer lost 4 of the people he loved most: his best friend and colleague Capito, his wife Elizabeth, and 3 of his own children. Just devastating. So after decades of work, after all that personal loss, Bucer's time in the city he poured his life into came to a really bitter end. The last chapter of his story would be spent in exile, hundreds of miles away from the home he'd known for 26 years.
The political situation had just turned completely against him. It got so dangerous that he literally had to flee Strasbourg in the middle of the night. He ended up in England, where he was welcomed by Archbishop Thomas Cranmer, who gave him a job teaching at Cambridge. For a little while, it probably felt like a fresh start.
But to understand just how alone he was, just listen to this. This is a quote from Heinrich Bullinger, another major reformer.
When he heard that Martin Luther had died, Bullinger basically said, "Great, now if only Bucer would die too, we could finally get something done." It just shows you, even his supposed allies had come to see him as an obstacle. And this just highlights the loneliness of his last years. He wrote this really heartbreaking letter back to his old friends in Strasbourg, pouring his heart out about his suffering and all the years he'd given them. You know what he got back? Nothing. Not a single reply. After everything he'd done, he was met with total silence.
So Bucer dies in 1551, and he gets this big, honorable funeral. But his story doesn't even end there. It gets weirder. 4 years later, the Catholic Queen Mary takes the throne, and she has his body dug up, put on trial for heresy, and then publicly burned. But wait, 5 years after that, the Protestant Queen Elizabeth is in charge, and she officially restores his honor. I mean, his body went on a crazier journey than most people do when they're alive. So what do we make of all this? What's the real legacy of a man who worked so hard but saw so many of his dreams just fail? And why has his voice faded from history when the shouts of the firebrands are still so loud? Well, here's the thing. His influence, even though it's kind of hidden, was massive. One historian described his impact as being like a crater on the moon. It's huge and it's there forever, even if you don't always know what caused it. You might not know his name, but his ideas left a permanent mark on huge chunks of Protestantism, especially in Anglican and Reformed churches. His work still matters. Which brings us to the big question I want to leave you with. Bucer's story really makes you wonder, doesn't it? In the grand sweep of history, why do we always remember the fighters, the dividers, the people who broke things? And why do the peacemakers, the uniters, the conciliators, why do they so often just fade away? What does that say about us and the stories we choose to tell?